Good morning, Catholic YouTube. Brian with City of the Immaculata here. Glad to be with you all. I have got a fascinating one for you guys today, and you may have to bear with me a little bit. I've been a little bit under the weather, so we'll just see how this goes. But anyways, yeah, fascinating one. We can get through it today. Pretty pertinent in the world of mass media and social media, and we have these populist rogue priests like a Father Altman or a Pavone, and this is a character that you may have never heard of. Yet if your grandparents, your great grandparents, or depending on your age, maybe even your great at this point, yeah, depending on your age here, and if they were in the U.S. in the 1930s, I can guarantee that they had heard of this particular person. And I'm talking about none other than Father James Coughlin, the great media orator of the early 20th century. Y'all didn't know that the greatest media commentator who came in the wake of this mass media of radio was a Catholic priest, did you? Now, I remember years ago, I can't remember how I came across people in general anyways, especially before the internet. I think I just read a lot, and certain names or personalities would just stick out, like, oh, this is somebody that I want to look into. I explicitly remember it happening one time, snapshot memory. I was in high school, and the reading assignment was Black Boy by Richard Wright. And one of the chapters was about his discovery of H.L. Mencken. And the way that he wrote about Mencken, I was just absolutely enamored, and I just had to find out more. And it took me years, mind you, for you young folks out there, before I managed to get my hands on a copy of Mencken's Prejudices at a little used bookstore, like randomly. But it was how I first came across his work, and I kind of miss that. I kind of miss that in a day when you can hear about someone and then just go look them up online and instantly, order works by them and have it on your doorstep in days. I kind of miss the wait and the search that you would have, back in my day. I don't remember where I first heard about Father Coughlin. And if I mispronounce his name, it is, I believe, Coughlin. I've seen it pronounced several ways, but the temptation is to say Coughlin. That is not correct. It's the Cog. So Father Coughlin, I think it may have been in a college history course, either through a lecture or through a reading, where I ran across FDR saying that the two most dangerous men in the United States at the time were Huey Long, the Louisiana kingfish, another fascinating character, but we can't go down that rabbit hole, unfortunately. And then the other one that FDR mentioned was Father Coughlin, and that may have been what first piqued my interest. Yet it wasn't until years after that I think I came across a broadcast of his on I just downloaded a file on the internet. Gosh, this would have been like 2003 or 4. And look, I just remember hearing his voice, It was one of those like grainy 1930s broadcasts, and he was speaking against the corruption of American capitalists and the communist infiltrators. And man, he was absolutely riveting. I was ready to go march in the streets against the forces of evil and corruption after that one broadcast. You could hear just the power and the magnetism of his rhetoric. Decades, I mean, almost a century later, right? I would say go listen to him. I mean, there's some that are available online, lest you think I'm given to exaggeration here. He was just an extremely effective speaker. And the audiences, look, at the height of his power, he had probably more support than any one single person in the United States outside of President FDR himself. I mean, millions of people subscribed to his social justice magazine. Millions more tuned in every night to listen to him. This was an age where, at the end of the day, families, you wouldn't have a TV to come home to. You wouldn't have laptops, the internet. If you had anything, it was this tiny, this radio, new invention. Family would sit around and you would listen to your favorite programs. And after a day's work, family would sit around and, listen to their favorite shows. And he was one of the most listened to in the United States. Personally, this, again, confession here, this era is just one that I love. 1920s, 1930s. I mean, Brother, Can You Spare a Dime has to be one of my all-time favorite pop songs, popular songs. The Rudy Valley version, not the Bing Crosby version. But you pit that up against a Rich Men North of Richmond. I would pit it against it any day. I mean, it's way more hard hitting. If you think Rich Men North of Richmond is tough, brother, you ain't heard nothing yet. Go listen to the longing of this man who's down and out in that song. And it's endlessly fascinating to me, not it has its parallels to our own days, but with this populist sentiment, a voice could come along and command the attentions of millions of people. Such was Father Coughlin. Though he's of course not without his serious detractors then and now. The impetus for my covering him today, I have had this book on my bookshelves for many, many years now at this point. I finally got around to reading it a while back, a few months ago, and it is a tour de force in calumniation. It's probably the most complete hatchet job I have ever read of a biography. I mean, I can't think of, I've read biographies of Hitler that were more neutral than this biography. I tried to find out something about the author. It's Donald Warren. Couldn't find much on him. He clearly hates his subject. This work here, it's called Radio Priest, Charles Coughlin, the Father of Hate Radio. It's published in 2000, and he really wants to paint Coughlin in this vein of a 1980s Pat Robertson televangelist combined with sort of a Rush Limbaugh 90s conservative radio, where really the only comparison with the former is that he used media and he was a religious. And with the latter, that he used the radio. So there's really no other comparison besides that. Father Coughlin and the later players as these 1980s characters, there's its entirely different landscape than the one coming out of World War I, out of the Roaring '20s and into the worst of the Great Depression. I mean, this was an era when you could have anarchists going down to Wall Street in the middle of the day with a horse-drawn cart packed with explosives, stopping it there and blowing it up on a crowded corner of Wall Street. If you think I'm joking about that, go down to, I think it's 23rd Wall Street and see the remnants of the bombing still left in the side of a building there. There were several dead, hundreds injured. This was a time when hatred for the money changers was at an all-time high. And there's a reason that someone like Father Charles Coughlin was going to appeal and to resonate with the masses in the way that he did, as we shall see. But first, as always, let's do a little who were we talking about here? So, born in 1891 in Ontario, Canada, to a devout Irish Catholic family, as a young man, he toyed with going into law or sociology, but eventually decided on the priesthood, and he entered St. Basil's Seminary in Toronto in 1911 and joined a group called the Basilians, who emphasized medieval studies, in particular an emphasis on medieval notions of banking and money. And they wanted to see the church return to its old stances on usury, which is going to be very important for later on. This strict condemnation of usury was integral to his later stances and eventually to his popularity. He's ordained in 1916, where he takes up residence in Detroit, the bustling automotive capital of the world at the time. Remember what we're talking about. This is 1916. The car is a new invention. Henry Ford's Ford Model T is just a few years away, and the assembly factory lines and the advent of that sort of explosion is just on the horizon. In Detroit, with Bishop Gallagher's approval, he set about founding the National Shrine of the Little Flower, a very unique Art Deco style architecture. You kind of have to see it to believe it. I showed it to my wife. She wasn't impressed. I kind of like Art Deco. It didn't last very long. It's a very unique style. Anyways, go see the National Shrine of the Little Flower. That's was built under the guidance and care of Father Coughlin, and it was there that he interestingly ran into the ire of the KKK. In the 1930s, he says, quoting Father Coughlin here, he says, "Fiery crosses flashed their crimson light upon a peaceful starlit night. It occurred to me that surely no Christian would dare to use the emblem of love and sacrifice and charity to express hatred. Surely there must be some mistake. The whole ghastly affair, the red battalion of fiery crosses which blazed from the Gulf of the Great Lakes and from the Golden Gate to the Statue of Liberty, must have been lighted not by the torch of faith, but rather by a brand snatched from the hell of ignorance. Then, out of a clear sky, it was born the idea of the Radio League of the Little Flower. Let the radio pulpit, with its charity and tolerance, be the logical answer to the prejudice and bigotry of those who have been misinformed." So the story comes to us that the KKK, not particularly happy, and this is Detroit now, we're not talking about the deep south, guys, this is Detroit, way up north, not happy with Coughlin building this grand monument to the Catholic Church in their city, burnt crosses on the lawn of this shrine of our little flower. And it's reported that when Father Coughlin saw the cross burning, he was reported to have said, "Bigots, bigots, I'll construct a church that will withstand as a monument in the defiance of hatred." Only 2 weeks after its construction was complete, the KKK did try to burn it down, and the defiant priest showed his first taste of standing against the American machine, a machine that would eventually bring him down. But here in these early years, in 1926, as a pioneer of the medium, he began offering sermons about the Catholic faith over the radio. And at first, that's what his main focus was, really, just sermons on the faith. Yet by 1928, he began speaking more openly about politics when he spoke against a socialist candidate running for president. In October 1929, the U.S. stock market crashes and plunged America and the world into what we today refer to as a Great Depression. Now, you can't remove the events of a time from their contexts. The 1929 crash had worldwide significance. It helped to boost a floundering anti-Jewish German Nationalist Party into the spotlight over in Germany. And all over America, I mean, you have the Dust Bowl taking place at this time when the soil literally dried up and the dust storms swept across the Midwest. If you want to see something haunting and apocalyptic, go look at images of the Dust Bowl from this time when it was actually brought about by really poor farming practices. So if you think that human beings can't affect the weather, think again. Go look at the Dust Bowl. I actually had family that lost their generations old farms and had to move when the banks foreclosed on the farms. It was in Steinbeck's classic, The Grapes of Wrath, right? It was immortalized in that. When, remember the family in that novel, they ended up being friendly with certain leftist agitators at the end of that novel. You also have at the same time the Great Mississippian Flood, which seems to be forgotten about today. To this day, the most destructive flood in U.S. history. It was out of this flood, actually, that Long himself won his election to the governor, kickstarting that whole trajectory. At the same time, you have MacArthur, the general, later to be famous in World War II, here in the 1930s, using troops and tanks to roll over and tear gas a group of World War I veterans who were marching and camping on the White House lawn seeking their military pensions from the war that the government had never paid them. So this imagery here, you've got MacArthur firing on World War I veterans. Okay, so imagine if we were having that today. It's absolutely a devastating, apocalyptic time for the people that are alive. And the people themselves were ripe for a populist voice. Populist voices. And into this steps the medium of radio and the radio priest. In 1930 was the first time that he broadcast nationally through a new company called CBS, which you've probably heard of. He had a shortwave radio in Philadelphia that broadcast him worldwide. And within the year, as the bread and soup lines began to increase and grow longer and longer, Father Coughlin began to grow more political in his rhetoric. His fan mail at the shrine offices by the end of the year increased to 80,000 letters weekly. He basically gave CBS its first hit show. In 1931, he gave one of his most famous sermons called Prosperity, where he denounced worldwide banking and Bolshevism. This was a unique thing about him, where he would attack it from both ends. Banking interests and communist interests as well. He also went hard against the U.S. government's failures to address the growing depression, one that he would be intimately familiar with, as at times when he hit certain chords, he would receive up to 1.2 million letters from admirers and people down and out on their luck. He came to the attention and to the ire of Herbert Hoover, President Herbert Hoover, and the two had a bit of a public spat where we believe that Hoover actually tried to have his show suppressed unsuccessfully. And it's believed by historians that his sermons are partly responsible for ending the Hoover administration and bringing about the rise of the FDR administration. Now, the relationship between Father Coughlin and FDR is a complex and storied one. It starts from what seems a place of genuine admiration on the part of Father Coughlin for FDR. And Father Coughlin was behind and backed the New Deal as it was laid out, FDR's economic policy to fix the Great Depression. As it was laid out early in the 1930s, Father Coughlin backed it. And from FDR, it appears he was probably always distrustful of Father Coughlin and used the priest's influence simply to help win elections as the expedient opportunist that FDR was. There's also the probability that FDR knew the power that Coughlin was wielding, and that on a dime he could turn it against him, and due to him what he did to Hoover. According to Eleanor Roosevelt, his wife, FDR never really trusted or liked Father Coughlin ever. But FDR was an exceptionally smart man and an astute politician, and he co-opted some of Coughlin's sermons for his own campaign in the 1930s. He began talking directly about social justice, right? Social justice through social action, directly taken from the radio priest broadcasts. Father Coughlin, in turn, was borrowing simply from Rerum Novarum by Leo XIII. So because of this, Father Coughlin was led to believe, you could say he was duped by FDR to believe that he was sort of an insider man in the New Deal team, that when the New Deal team, the famous New Deal team that FDR had created around himself. And when he was swept into office in 1930, Coughlin was on the air lauding the New Deal as the savior of the Republic and the last great hope to avoid the fate of Bolshevik Russia. Because remember, the fear was at this time, it's so hard to like lose. I mean, it's so easy to lose the perspective of what it was like for people at the time. The fear at this time was that a soft turn left would, excuse me, not the fear, the hope was that a soft turn left would prevent what people feared would be a hard turn left that Russia had just underwent with the Bolsheviks. So the New Deal was sold as this sort of moderate voice against extremists that wanted to usher in red violence in the streets of America. You're only a decade removed from the Red Scare era that happened here in the U.S., where the U.S. was going after all of these voices as agitators for Leninism here in the United States. Complicating things is that FDR did actually bring Father Coughlin into the White House. He did counsel with him, but it's impossible to say if this was FDR being counseled by the radio priest or just simply placating him so that he wouldn't turn his massive audience against the new burgeoning administration. I have a feeling it's probably the latter. The falling out would come when it became clear that FDR was more friendly to the banking class than Father Coughlin felt was acceptable. And I mean, FDR had been toying with the gold standard from very early on in his presidency. He eventually backed up all the bank's credit with the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which was designed to keep people from running on banks by insuring deposits up to a certain amount of money. And this was looking out, as far as Coughlin was concerned, this was looking out for banking interests over the actual interests of the American people. So on one side, you have this idealist priest who sees things really in a stark black and white, right and wrong. On the other side, you have this opportunist, a realist, who will make deals with strange bedfellows, as astute politicians so often do. And he's, I mean, FDR is the first and foremost a politician seeking to build coalitions that Father Coughlin never really had to concern himself with. So it wasn't long before Father Coughlin started to turn his mic against the president. Now, remember his early days in the Basilian movement, he had an inherent distrust of banks and lenders from the go. Usury was ever on his tongue. He was adamant about this from the day that he took to the airwaves, and FDR knew this, which was why he kind of kept the priest at an arm's length. But Coughlin was his own man. He knew the gig was up. So in 1934, he formally broke with the New Deal when he created his own National Union for Social Justice. And here is the union's platform. I think you guys will find this rather interesting. Let me find the page here. So he's publicly breaking with FDR in the New Deal. And he's saying, I'm coming up with this. It's called the National Union for Social Justice. Here is our platform. 1, liberty of conscience and education. 2, a just living annual wage for all labor. 3, The nationalization of resources too important to be held by individuals. 4. Private ownership of all other property. 5. The use of private property to be controlled for the public good. 6. The abolition of the privately owned Federal Reserve Board and the institution of a central government-owned bank. So he's for a government-owned bank. That would take me down a whole other. That goes back to he's got some Hamiltonian roots there somewhere. 7. The return of Congress of the right to coin and regulate money. 8. Control of the cost of living and the value of money by the central bank. 9. The cost of production plus a fair profit for the farmer. 10. The right of the laboring man to organize unions and the duty of the government to protect these organizations against the vested interests of wealth and of intellect. 11. The recall of all non-productive bonds. 12. Abolition of tax-exempt bonds. 13. Broadening of the base of taxation on the principle of ownership and the ability to pay. 14. Simplification of government and lightening taxation on the laboring class. 15. In time of war, conscription of wealth as well as men. 16. Human rights to be held above property rights. Government's chief concern should be with the poor. The rich can take care of themselves. So that's quite a platform, okay? There's no real equivalent to that in today's age, but we can say, if you are familiar with Pope Leo XIII, that I know right and left like to try to claim Rerum Novarum as their own, but I think he's pretty clearly following Catholic social teaching right there with that platform. There might be some tweaks here and there and some unique things that he's adding with his own peculiarities, but overall, it's a pretty solid platform. Now, given that at this point he is at the height of his power and the influence the Union had was a potent force from day one, and FDR realized he had a foe that could bring his whole project to a grinding halt, if not completely bring it down altogether. In January 1935, FDR tried to pull a vote in Congress to have the U.S. join the World Court, and it seemed that he was going to get his way, except that on January 27th, Coughlin took to the airways denouncing the legislation as a sellout to international banking interests. The Senate failed to pass it. Coughlin had won an astonishing political victory. And it's not unlike, say, the shock of political agitation after the formation of the printing press, when politicians and powers were sort of catching up with the power of this new medium, right? At first the printing press, now the radio, and the sheer force that it was able to harness. Think of the scene in Brother, Where Art Thou? For those of you that remember that movie, where the scene where the humorously the politician is going to this little tiny radio station out in the middle of nowhere, and he's like, look, we're trying to reach the mass audiences. The days of politicking one-on-one are gone. Well, that's just a real thing. And Coughlin was a pioneer in this. I mean, he ground the president of the United States, the most powerful office in the world, a legislative proposal into the dirt, stopping it. A mere lone voice on the radio against the most powerful office held by arguably the most powerful president since Abraham Lincoln. And this gets me to the next part of this, and probably the thing that led to ultimately to his demise, Father Coughlin's demise. In the 1930s in the United States, there was a very potent and powerful isolationist movement. It had existed in the 19-teens. Even President Woodrow Wilson ran on it against Teddy Roosevelt, who was Teddy Roosevelt was arguing to get us involved in this massive European war that was underway. Wilson ran against it, ended up actually getting us involved in it in the unbelievably devastating horrors of World War I, the war that, in my opinion, is the worst and most consequential war in all of human history. After it was over, though, Americans felt that they had been lied to and betrayed by certain British interests. And Americans didn't hate the Germans. There was a huge anti-German campaign during the war. Once the war was over, though, we had large German populations of German immigrants, and Britain and France after World War I sought the most vengeful, hateful, evil treaty ever forced upon a people after a war in peace settlement terms. I mean, it economically brought Germany to the point of mass starvation. I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles that was forced upon the German people there was mass starvation that was taking place in Germany because of this treaty. What's his name? Young Churchill kind of gloated over the fact, let the children starve. In fact, it was actually a young Herbert Hoover who, in the Coolidge administration, sent relief teams to Germany to feed the children there. And Americans at the time were just absolutely shocked and appalled at what the European allies were doing to the Germans. And out of this grew a certain movement that was sympathetic to all things German, contra the lying, cheating Brits and French. And it's actually here that you get the would-be the sympathizers of later German nationalist parties. Now, many people saw the Nazis for what they were, including at times Father Coughlin himself. Though at times he and others thought that the Nazi Party provided Europe a bulwark against the encroaching, godless Soviet powers who, in the 1920s and 1930s, were actively conspiring for a worldwide revolution. Just look up, go. It's probably available. I've got an old copy of it back in my office. Lenin after the Third International, right? I mean, the Comintern were very clear of what their goals were. They wanted to spark worldwide revolution, which per Marx, per Lenin, per the Comintern, they wanted it to start in Germany. So if you were aware of all of this and you were keeping up with world events and you wanted to prevent this, then you would almost instinctually back parties that offered solutions against this seemingly unstoppable tide of Leninism. Coughlin, though, himself, more than a Nazi sympathizer, just really wanted America left out of all things European. And the prospects of a war with Russia and the worldwide Comintern loomed large in people's minds in the 1930s. I mean, they thought World War II was coming, and that it would be Europe against the commies. That's what the outlook was. So again, the German Nazi Party ran as a defense against this tide. So in the United States, though, in this dynamic, you get men like Charles Lindbergh or Joseph Kennedy, the patriarch of the Kennedy family, who was in the FDR administration. You have Henry Ford, and you have Father Charles Coughlin as voices of this, what we today refer to as the isolationist movement. And in the 1930s, when the soup lines were growing, and they were, you could go to a soup line that was lines around the block, people waiting in line every single day for a loaf of bread. Talk of focusing on the United States and staying out of Europe's the never-ending mire of European politics, it found a willing audience. Father Coughlin tapped into this fear when he preached that the United States government should focus its attention on the poor and the displaced. Now, within this, of course, you always have FDR sort of worried. FDR is kind of keeping his eyes on the affairs in Europe. He knows eventually we're going to be dragged into this war. Yet he's got this ever the thorn in his side, this radio priest. He actually sends Joseph Kennedy to Father Coughlin, which is an interesting choice. Kennedy was Catholic himself. Both are isolationists. Both were originally New Dealers, though, of course, as we stated, Father Coughlin sort of fell out of favor with the New Deal. And while the two men got along at first, anyways, Kennedy admired Father Coughlin and the power that this man could wield through his oratory skills. It would be little that he could actually do to sort of rein in Father Coughlin and bring him back around to the New Deal and FDR. So Coughlin was on a mission to call out the direction that he felt that the New Deal was headed, that he felt that the U.S. government was headed by aiding the British in this. Before we were involved in the war, we were helping the British all that we could. And again, remember, there's a lot of people that just still felt betrayed by the British from World War I. Now, as we get into 1935, the campaign for the 36 election gets underway. FDR would famously lament publicly at this time that the two people that were his greatest threats were Father Coughlin and Huey Long. Long would be assassinated on the steps of the courthouse in Louisiana and wouldn't survive 35, so that really just left Father Coughlin. And FDR, he had to bring him down or hope that he'd fall himself. Well, what ultimately brought Coughlin down was, unfortunately, he got caught up in a certain type of libel. It's something that has gripped European minds for decades, especially in this era. You're in the wake of the writing of this notorious pamphlet called the Protocols for the Elders of Zion. It had been disseminated out of Russia, and it was just this belief that there was this Zionist cabal that was out there trying to take over the world. Now, it didn't help that both Lenin and Trotsky had Jewish blood. Never mind the fact that there were a lot of Christians that were involved in the Bolshevik movement, including its leader starting from the 1930s onwards, Joseph Stalin, who had been a seminarian in the Russian Orthodox Church. But once this myth like this gets created, and spreads, it has potency, especially when people are tired or they're scared or they're in fear for their next meal. Scapegoats make us give easy outs. And Coughlin really kind of walked the line. Was he blatantly anti-Semitic? It's hard to say. I think there's two ways that you would have to define it, because we define it much more sensitively today, now that we have the hindsight of the Holocaust behind us, especially since the Nazis basically made anti-Semitism a focal point for their entire platform. We kind of have to judge these things a little bit differently. He certainly did believe that there were Jewish bankers that had nefarious plans. And it's a shame, really, that he ties all of that into the sort of objective evils of the banking class that he could have stuck to. He ties it into this one group, which I think is unfortunate. I mean, that myth kind of has its origins going back even before this time, right? I mean, the Jews, because of the laws of usury, the Jews were given the responsibility of being lenders because they weren't held to canon law like we were. So we give them this responsibility. They become very good at it, and then we in turn sort of resent them for it. The very job that we gave them to do. International banking and international Bolshevism were both serious problems, serious threats, but the solution never should have been sympathy for fascist parties, nor to scapegoat a race of people as diverse as any on earth, really. I mean, the Jews themselves were, there were and are some that are more right-wing and fascist than even the best that Christianity could muster. They're just a diverse group of people. So to lump them all into this one group, but it does seem that Coughlin kind of took the bait, and he paid for it, right? When the tide was turning to America's involvement in the war, he dug his heels in on the isolation movement. Rightly so, I would say, as far as that goes. Our involvement in World War II was not a sure thing, still even up to the late 1930s. But by the time of Pearl Harbor, to be an isolationist was sort of the end of your career. It brought down many men who had been popular. Most of all, it brought down Father Coughlin. He never recovered. when we get swept into the war and the war machine got to moving, it was all over for America standing alone. And then we have the rest of that history. Now, objectively, I could sit here and say that we have hindsight that the people in the 30s didn't have. Except for the most astute observers, most people didn't actually think Hitler's party was a major threat. Many people actually sympathized with their cause. Even after the German annexation of Austria and Czechoslovakia, I mean, it's hard to categorize this stuff. You have one German Jewish man, gosh, I can't remember his name. He was a World War I veteran, total right winger. Even agreed with the Nazis that there was a Jewish problem in Germany, wanted to join them, and wished that the Nazis were able to differentiate between good and bad Jews. So I wish I could remember his name. Evans speaks about him quite a bit in his 3-part history of the German Nazi movement, and that book that he did. Outside of Germany, though, at first, most people didn't even take Hitler seriously. I mean, it's like, who is this guy? Some failed bohemian painter who tried and failed to start a coup? Like what? And now he's chancellor? This has to be a joke. It really wasn't until the Night of Long Knives, when Hitler purged his party of its radical members, that world leaders actually took notice. Like, oh wow, this guy's actually kind of shrewd, right? Because you see, this is an aside, but it's all related to this. The German military, which was wholly independent from the German government at the time, was not about to accept the Nazi regime that had just been elected with its unhinged brown shirts who were causing all this trouble in the streets. And the German military easily could have ousted Hitler. So Hitler had a choice: side with these long-term supporters of my party who helped to actually bring me into power, or to side with the army. And a lunatic fanatic would have sided with his supporters, yet Hitler sided with the army against his own party. He had Ernst Röhm and other members of the SA murdered on the Night of Long Knives. So, yet even after that, though people started to take him a little bit more seriously after that, no one seriously thought that he would try to exterminate all the Jews of Europe. For most of the 1930s, the Nazi MO was to extort and terrorize Jews and run them out of the country. It wasn't until after the war, and even then it wasn't until after the Wannsee Conference, that you get them putting into effect this absolutely insane plan to eradicate Europe of all Jews. And if you look at the manpower and the effort they put into that, it was just utterly wasteful, not just in terms of the human element, right? Like, there's the tragedy of the waste of the human element, but even for like a monstrous inhuman psychopaths, you could maybe, like, why didn't they ever like stand back and say, hey, maybe we should instead like focus on this war that we've started on 2 fronts, right? The French side and the Russian side. Now we're starting a war. We got a war on 2 fronts, and we're focused on this insane plan over here, right? Yet, given that Father Coughlin had swallowed the what we today could classify as the anti-Semite pill, and what we came to learn later of just how far the Nazis had gone when they began enacting their final solution towards the end of the war, you can't look at him out of context of the wider picture. His legacy, no matter how good, no matter what good he may have accomplished, or what good he could have accomplished had he not gone this route. I mean, I think history would be much more forgiving of him today had he just been a simple isolationist, or had he just gone after the banking class, qua banking class, and not as the banking class in opposition to this like sort of worldwide Zionist cabal. But, such is life. He made his bed. And in my opinion, there's no real defending that aspect of Father Coughlin. The sad thing is there are many things to admire about him. I mean, I love the platform of his union. It's one that I could really get behind today. this is one of those things where like I want to extract the good from this story and just leave the bad. But and I'm laying my cards out here a bit, right? Like I am no fan of unfettered capitalism, as I don't think any good Catholic could be. I think it makes everything, even the sacred, something to be bought and sold on the exchange market. And I think it appeals and markets to our baser elements, and especially young people that are forming their conscience. It helps to peddle filth that has left a generation of men and women, young men, young women, each generation coming up, it seems to get worse, addicted to various forms of consumerism. And he saw this and he went after that. I think in today's age, we've pretty much firmly discredited Bolshevism. Marxism is something of a joke term now. It's used to like attack people that aren't even remotely near what Marx actually taught. But the banking class, this is probably something that would get me shut down on YouTube. I mean, okay, well, look, here's what you do. Go watch this. It's a brilliant scene from this 1970s movie called Network. And the scene is so meta. It's absolutely insane. There's this billionaire CEO saying that they are actually the ones who own and run the world, that is the CEOs, the businessmen of the world, and that even today's Marxists at heart are just businessmen, and that the world is nothing but a giant mass of potential consumers to these people. Go watch that. It's a wonderful movie called Network, 1970s. And that particular scene with, oh, what's his name? He was a great actor, character actor. Ned Beatty, I think was his name. Anyways, it's a great role for him. Men like Father Coughlin could have been great forerunners to a sort of Catholic consciousness under the banner of Rerum Novarum as our sort of platform that we move on, a sort of consciousness that like permeates and overthrows money changers. But alas, where Father Coughlin failed, it sort of falls on us to build up the kingdom. As unfortunate as a character as he turns out to be, the good that he's recommended and that he brought is something that I think that we could still extract, while at the same time acknowledging that he made some serious judgments. I think because of this as well, too, while he does fall under this category of populist priest, he's very much unlike a Father Altman or a Pavone in the sense that you never really get with Coughlin there's a certain disobedience with him when it comes to certain American political figures. Yes, he would not obey. I don't necessarily get the sense that he did that with his superiors. I think many of his superiors were actually rather sympathetic to a lot of his opinions. But anyways, so that's what I got for you guys today. I don't really recommend this book. It's sort of a hit piece book. I'm just going to go in the recycling bin for me. I don't want to get out there. Whoever you are, Donald Warren, 20 years ago you wrote this book. It's not. It's clearly a book that's designed to smear every bit of a person who I think actually has quite a few good traits to him, even though I can objectively stand back and say, some of the stuff was pretty awful. But anyways, guys, that's what we got today. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I got some more American stuff coming for you guys. There's some stuff I'm going to be putting out. I'm going to cover the Scopes monkey trial. I'm going to discuss some things about eugenics and America's dark past with contraceptives and eugenics. So stay tuned for all of that stuff. I got some more early 20th century Americana for you guys that I think you'll enjoy if you enjoyed this particular story. So anyways, God bless you all. Take care. I'll see you soon.